The students who enter Blackthorn Academy are never seen anywhere else. There are no records of their existence before arriving. No parents come to visit. No letters are sent home. And yet, they are here. Girls dressed in dark uniforms, their faces pale, their expressions empty. They move in silence, their shadows flickering unnaturally beneath candlelight. Sometimes they murmur in languages that do not exist, and sometimes they murmur without moving their lips. No one asks where they come from. No one asks what happens to the ones who break the rules, because everyone already knows. Blackthorn Academy has 6 rules. They are absolute. They are not guidelines. They are not suggestions. They are survival. Rule 1. Never acknowledge the things that stand in the hallways after midnight. Rule 2. Do not let a student write your name. Rule 3. If you hear someone calling your name from outside, know you didn't. Rule 4. Every classroom must have a mirror. Do not cover it. Do not break it. Rule 5. If a student tells you they had a dream about you, report it immediately. Rule 6. The headmistress is always watching, even when she's not. The rules were given on the first night. They were not explained, because those who need an explanation do not last long. The dormitories were colder than the night outside. The beds were lined in perfect rows, the covers all tucked so tightly it looked as though no one had ever touched them. The walls were bare, empty spaces where portraits should have hung. Only the candle beside each bed flickered dimly, casting strange, twisting shapes along the floor. Something was wrong with the air. Thick, suffocating, heavy with the scent of dust and something else, something metallic. Then came the first sound, a slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap. A noise just beyond the door. At first, it was distant, almost rhythmic, like footsteps walking the halls. But then it changed. The taps grew irregular, closer, stopping and starting again as though someone or something was testing the doors. The breath of every student in the dormitory hitched at once. They knew what walked the halls at night. The candlelight dimmed. The air grew colder. The tapping stopped just outside the door. And then, a whisper. It was not human. It was not words. It was something else, a deep, hollow resonance that made the walls tremble, the air shudder, the stomach churn. It slithered through the cracks of the door, curling into the ears of anyone foolish enough to listen. No one moved. No one acknowledged it. Then, the door handle twitched. Something was trying to get in. It was a test. It was always a test. And those who failed disappeared. The first week passed in silence. No laughter. No conversations. No casual chatter between students. Words carried weight in Blackthorn, and the wrong ones could kill. The classroom was colder than the rest of the school. The windows were sealed shut, frost creeping across the glass even though it was not winter. Each desk was arranged precisely, the students already seated by the time the professor entered. Their eyes followed his every move, but they did not blink enough. The lesson began. A lecture on ancient sigils, the kind that held power even when left unfinished. The professor spoke cautiously, careful never to utter the wrong incantation aloud. Then a girl raised her hand. "Professor Halloway, may I practice my sigils?" A nod. A mistake. The girl took out her quill, dipping it into ink that gleamed too darkly under the candlelight. She pressed it to the parchment, her fingers steady, her lips barely moving as she whispered something beneath her breath. Then a pause, a hesitation. Her eyes flickered up, and she began to write his name. The ink on the parchment moved, not like liquid, not like normal writing. It shifted, twisted, pulsed. The letters did not form properly, refusing to remain in place, curling into something else, a sigil of possession. The professor lunged forward, snatching the parchment before the ink could finish drying. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. His hands trembled. The girl only smiled, a slow, knowing smile. She never attended class again. That night, when the professor looked in the mirror before bed, his reflection did not look away. The third rule came on the 7th night. A storm raged outside, the wind howling through the cracks in the stone walls. The darkness outside the window was too deep, too endless. The trees swayed, their branches bending at unnatural angles. Then, a voice. Soft, familiar, distant. "Professor Halloway?" It came from outside, from beyond the school gates. The voice of a student, one who had vanished days ago. She sounded lost, confused, afraid. "Professor, please. I don't know where I am. Please, help me." His fingers twitched toward the window latch. Then he stopped. The voice was too flat, too perfect. It was not human. It was not a student. It was something else. And it was calling his name. He backed away from the window. And outside, in the endless dark, something moved. Not a shift of the wind, not the rustle of branches, something else. Something deliberate. The storm raged on, but the voice had fallen silent. A hush settled over the school, pressing into the walls, seeping into the very stone. The candles burned lower, the flames flickering wildly despite the absence of a breeze. The air inside felt heavier now, thicker, as if something unseen had slithered into the space and refused to leave. Professor Halloway did not sleep that night. Neither did the students. They knew. The silence wasn't safety. It was a trap. The next morning, 3 students were missing. Their beds remained untouched. The sheets still tucked in, smooth and perfect, as though they had never been there at all. The room smelled faintly of something burned, something foul, lingering in the air like a warning. The other students did not ask questions. They knew better. Everyone did. Breakfast was served in the grand dining hall, the long tables stretching endlessly beneath the candlelit chandeliers. Food was arranged in abundance. Plates of fruit, steaming bread, meats sliced so thin they were almost transparent. And yet, no one ate. The headmistress stood at the front of the room, watching. She did not blink. Her eyes moved too smoothly over the students, too controlled, as if she weren't watching them with human eyes, but something else entirely. When she finally spoke, her voice carried too clearly, untouched by the distance between them. A reminder. Silence. The rules exist for a reason. Those who forget will not be given second chances. A pause. Her gaze lingered on Professor Halloway, sharp and unmoving, as if she knew he had heard the voice last night, as if she knew he had almost answered. The next words came slowly, measured. Lessons continue as scheduled. Do not concern yourselves with those who are no longer here. And then she smiled. It was not a smile of reassurance. It was a warning. One of the students dropped their fork. The sound echoed far louder than it should have. The headmistress did not react. She only turned, moving toward the great doors at the end of the hall, and as she passed beneath the towering archway, the candlelight dimmed. The moment she was gone, the whispers began. 3 gone in one night. Not gone, erased. They weren't even the first. The last voice was barely above a breath. They won't be the last. Professor Halloway sat motionless. The food on his plate had grown cold. He stared down at the surface of the table, at the small silver spoon beside his cup. The reflection on the polished surface shimmered, bent, shifted. Something was standing behind him, watching, his breath locked in his throat. He did not turn around. He did not acknowledge it. Slowly, the spoon stilled. The reflection settled, and the presence behind him was gone. The day passed without incident, but the sense of unease never left. The classrooms felt colder. The hallways stretched longer than before, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. The whispers in the corridors grew more frequent, slipping between the cracks in the walls, voices speaking in tongues long forgotten. Then, the mirror cracked. It happened during an advanced spellwork lesson. A student, a girl named Evelyn Rhodes, was practicing an incantation, her hands moving steadily over the aged parchment before her. She spoke softly, carefully, but the moment the final syllable left her lips, a shriek. Not from her, from the mirror. The glass split down the center, a jagged line forming with a sound like screaming metal. The candles flickered violently, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. And for a moment, just a fraction of a second, something moved behind the broken reflection. Not Evelyn, not any of the students, something else. The headmistress appeared almost instantly. No footsteps, no sound. She was simply there. The air in the room tightened, as if the very walls had begun to close in. No one spoke, no one moved. Then the headmistress lifted one hand, and Evelyn screamed. She collapsed to the floor, her body seizing violently, her breath coming in ragged, choking gasps. Her hands clawed at her throat, her eyes wide, unseeing. And then, she went still, limp, lifeless. The silence was unbearable. The headmistress looked at the students, her face void of expression. The mirrors are not to be broken. Her voice was calm, cold. This is why. No one dared to breathe. Then, without another word, she turned, stepping away from the lifeless body on the floor. The moment she left the room, the air shifted, the walls settled, the temperature rose, and the students moved on. Because at Blackthorn, you do not ask what happens to the dead. You pretend they never existed. That night, the halls were quieter than usual. The storm had passed, but the air was still thick with something unseen, something waiting. Professor Holloway did not sleep. He sat in the dim light of his office, the candle beside him barely flickering. The weight of the night pressed against his shoulders, a whisper of something too ancient, too malevolent, curling at the edges of his mind. A soft sound echoed through the hall. Footsteps, slow, measured, wrong. And then, a knock at his door. 3 sharp raps, precise. He stared at the wood, breath shallow. The candle flickered. The knock came again. He did not answer. The air in the room grew heavier, the walls seeming to breathe. The shadows at the corners stretched, reaching, curling toward him like unseen hands. The knock came one last time. And then, a voice, low, hollow, familiar. "Professor Holloway, let me in." His blood turned to ice, because the voice belonged to Evelyn Rhodes, the girl who had died just hours ago. He did not move. He did not breathe. And outside the door, in the impossible silence, something waited. The candle on Professor Holloway's desk withered, shrinking to a dying ember, as if the very air in the room rejected the presence beyond the door. His pulse pounded in his ears. "Professor Holloway, let me in." Evelyn's voice was too steady, too clear, too alive. His hand trembled as he reached for the drawer beneath his desk. Inside, wrapped in aged cloth, was a small dagger. The blade was iron, old, worn, but still sharp enough to slice through flesh. Necessary protection in a school where the dead did not always stay buried. The knock came again. 3 slow raps, measured, precise, wrong. A terrible thought clawed its way into his mind. What if it wasn't her? What if it was something wearing her voice? He swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. "You are dead," he whispered. The voice outside the door laughed, soft, wrong. A cold, rattling breath slipped through the cracks beneath the door, seeping into the room like mist. His fingers curled around the hilt of the dagger. His heartbeat thundered. Then, the doorknob turned. Not fast, not frantic, slow, deliberate. The metal creaked, twisting under unseen hands. But the door did not open. It simply moved. An inch forward, another. Then, with a shudder, it stopped. And the voice outside changed. The calmness drained from it. The mimicry of humanity peeled away like dead skin. "Let me in." A whisper too low. "Let me in." A sound too fractured. "Let me in." Something slammed against the wood, hard. Professor Holloway staggered back, dagger raised. The candle flickered wildly, its flame sputtering in a sudden, icy draft. The walls groaned, the floorboards beneath his feet trembling. Then, the air shifted, the pressure lifted, and just like that, it was gone. No footsteps, no lingering breath, just the hollow, aching absence of whatever had stood beyond the door. Holloway exhaled shakily. His grip on the dagger tightened. He did not sleep that night. Morning arrived in silence. The students moved through the halls like ghosts, their faces pale, their eyes sunken. They had heard it too. At breakfast, no one spoke. No one mentioned Evelyn Rhodes. The headmistress stood at the front of the hall, her presence heavier than the air itself. She did not smile. She did not need to. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. The 6th rule is the most important of all. A hush fell over the room. You do not open the door after midnight. No one dared to look up. No one except Professor Holloway. Her gaze locked onto him immediately, as if she knew, as if she had been watching. His stomach turned to ice. Failure to follow this rule will not only cost your life, a pause, a smile. It will cost your soul. Something shuddered through the room, a presence, a warning. And then breakfast resumed. The students ate in silence. That night, Professor Holloway did not stay in his quarters. The feeling of being watched had not left him. The presence behind the door had been too real, too insistent. So he walked the halls instead. The corridors stretched endlessly beneath the dim candlelight, their edges frayed with shadows that moved when they shouldn't. His footsteps barely made a sound. He passed the classrooms, empty now, their desks sitting in perfect silence. The portraits along the walls stared at him with too intense eyes, their painted faces subtly changing when he looked away. And then, ahead, a figure, standing at the end of the hall, still, silent, watching. A girl in a school uniform, her long dark hair hanging limp over her shoulders. Professor Holloway's breath caught. It was Evelyn. Her back was turned, her form unnervingly motionless. His fingers tightened around the dagger in his coat pocket. She wasn't real. She couldn't be. He took a slow step forward, then another. The air grew colder. She did not move. Evelyn. His voice barely carried, her head tilted, not turned, tilted, a slow, unnatural angle. The breath in his lungs turned to ice. Then, the lights flickered, and Evelyn moved. Not with footsteps, not with sound. One moment she was across the hall. The next, she was standing right in front of him, face to face. Her skin was pale, too pale. Her lips were blue. Her eyes were not her eyes. They were black, completely black, and her mouth stretched into a smile that did not belong on a human face. "Professor Holloway," she whispered. Then her jaw unhinged. The candlelight died, and the darkness swallowed everything. Not just the corridor, not just the walls. It was deeper than shadow, heavier than the absence of light. It was suffocating, alive. Professor Holloway couldn't see, couldn't move. The blackness pressed in around him, thick and cold, wrapping over his skin like something with fingers and breath. A whisper slithered through the void. Professor Holloway, Evelyn's voice, but wrong. Too stretched, too layered. Something else was speaking with her. His breath came out in quick, ragged gasps. His hand tightened around the dagger in his pocket. The iron blade, his last defense. Then, a hand closed around his wrist, cold, clawing. Wrong. His pulse slammed against his ribs. The grip tightened. The voice came from everywhere. "Let me in." Holloway ripped free. He stumbled backward, heart hammering against his ribs, the blackness still clinging to his skin like oil. But then, light, a single flickering candle burst into existence down the hallway. Not warm, not inviting, but enough to reveal she was still there. Evelyn, or what was left of her. Her body was limp, hanging in the air like a marionette. Her limbs bent at unnatural angles, head lolling as if her neck had no bones. Her face, her mouth, still locked in that grotesque, inhuman grin. And behind her, the thing holding her up, a shape too thin, too stretched, too long-limbed to be human. Its fingers curled around her shoulders, its nails like black needles. It had no face, just a hollow, yawning void where its eyes should be. Holloway's stomach twisted. His fingers burned against the dagger's hilt. He knew what this was. He knew what had found him. A hollow one. One of the things that walked these halls when rules were broken. It wasn't Evelyn anymore. It was wearing her. His breath came too fast, his thoughts spinning like unraveling thread. The 6th rule. You do not open the door after midnight. He hadn't, but he had spoken, acknowledged her. That had been enough. A sharp, wet crack snapped through the air. Evelyn's head snapped toward him. Her spine arched backward, her mouth split wider. And then it moved. Not with footsteps, not with weight. It glided. One moment it was at the end of the hall. The next it was inches from his face. Its fingers touched his skin, cold, crawling, invading. Holloway's vision blurred. A static hiss filled his skull, burrowing into his mind like insects in rotting wood. A voice whispered inside his head. "We are already inside." The candlelight flickered, then died. Everything vanished. Holloway woke up in his quarters. His throat was raw, his head pounded, every nerve in his body buzzing like he'd been somewhere he shouldn't have. His fingers ached. When he looked down, his nails were split. The dagger, his only defense, was still clenched in his fist. But something else was in the room. Something was breathing, a slow, wet inhale. Holloway's body turned to ice. The sound was coming from behind him, his bed, from the space beneath it. His pulse slammed against his ribs. The weight of the rule burned into his skull. Do not look under the beds after sundown. His hands trembled. His lungs fought for air. The breathing did not stop. It was closer than it should have been. A voice crawled out from the darkness beneath the bed. Not Evelyn. Something else. "We are still inside, Professor." A hand shot out. Gray, withered. Not human. It grabbed his ankle. He did not scream. He ran. Outside, the corridors were worse than before. Something had changed. The walls breathed. The portraits twitched. The candlelight didn't reach the ends of the halls anymore, like the darkness was growing. Holloway forced his shaking legs forward. He had to find the headmistress. He had to fix this. The rules existed for a reason. He had broken one. And now something was inside him. Watching. Waiting. Holloway wasn't alone anymore. And he knew he would never be alone again. Something was inside him. Not physically. Not a presence he could shake off. It was deeper than that. A wrongness had settled beneath his skin, slithering through his veins like cold, living ink. Every shadow stretched too far. Every whisper seemed to breathe his name. Every door in the corridor looked like it was waiting. His footsteps didn't echo right. They should have bounced back against the stone walls. Instead, it sounded like something else was walking with him, following. But when he turned, nothing, just the endless, suffocating corridors of Blackthorn Academy. A sharp, wet tap echoed behind him. His pulse stuttered. Another tap, then another, like bare feet slapping against cold stone. Running. His breath came in short, sharp bursts. He forced himself forward. If he stopped, if he hesitated, he knew something would catch up. The headmistress. He had to find the headmistress. She was the only one who understood the depth of these rules. Another tap. Closer. Holloway's stomach curled into knots. He reached the door to her office, his fingers shaking violently as he turned the handle. Locked. A whisper brushed against his ear. She's not in there. His throat closed. His spine turned to ice. That voice, it had come from right behind him. Holloway turned. Nothing. Nothing. Except for the darkness at the end of the corridor. Except for the door standing slightly open. The door that shouldn't exist. A door he had never seen before. A single candle burned inside, flickering, waiting. His mind screamed not to move, not to step forward. But his legs, his body, wasn't entirely his anymore. Something tugged him forward, step by step, until the candlelight licked against his skin, until the scent of something rotten curled in his lungs, until his eyes adjusted and he saw the headmistress. She hung in the center of the room, not by a rope, by hands. Hundreds of them. Black, withered fingers curling over her limbs, her torso, her face, pulling her apart piece by piece. Her mouth still moved, forming words, but no sound came out. Only silence, only watching. A single whisper curled into his skull. You brought them here. The candle went out, and then they moved. Holloway didn't remember running. Didn't remember how he got back into the hallway, how the air had turned thick and wet, how his hands were slick with something dark and cold. His own breath sounded foreign. Something had changed. The school no longer felt like a school. It felt like a thing, a living, breathing thing. Every wall pulsed. The paintings had turned their heads toward him. The floor was no longer stone. It moved. A heavy, sluggish twitch beneath his feet. The door at the far end of the hallway creaked open on its own. Inside, a classroom, empty, silent, except for the single chalkboard and the message written across it in crimson. You are breaking the rules. Holloway's breath caught. The letters dripped, not chalk, not ink, something worse, something still fresh. And beneath it, another line formed, right in front of him, invisible fingers scraping against the board. We are already here. The whisper curled inside his skull. Holloway's vision blurred, the walls shuddered, his heartbeat no longer in sync with his own body. The school had taken something from him, and it wasn't done yet. Something moved outside the classroom, slow, deliberate. The flickering candlelight couldn't reach far enough to show what it was, but Holloway already knew. He had seen it before. The hollow one. It stood motionless, waiting, not attacking, not reaching, just standing there, watching him with the absence of eyes. His fingers tightened around the dagger. He knew the rule. Do not speak to the ones that stand too still. But that rule had already been broken. The hollow one was inside him now, and it knew his name. Holloway did the only thing left to do. He ran. He didn't stop. Not when the walls moaned around him. Not when the floors breathed beneath his feet. Not when the shadows stretched like hands reaching for his throat. The school was closing in. It was hungry, and he had broken too many rules. At the end of the hall, a door, wide open. Beyond it, the night, a way out. He didn't care if it was a trick, didn't care if the school had never let anyone leave before. He had no choice. He ran through it, and the moment his foot crossed the threshold, the world shattered. Holloway hit the ground hard, but it wasn't the ground. It moved beneath him, something cold, something wet. It slithered under his hands like muscle and sinew stretched too thin. He pushed himself up, gasping, and froze. The school was gone, but he hadn't escaped. He had fallen into something worse. The air was thick, clotted. He tried to breathe, but the air fought him. It wasn't oxygen. It wasn't anything human. The world around him wasn't a world at all. It was a place that shouldn't exist, a place made of things that watched. The sky, if it could be called that, was alive. Dark shapes twitched overhead, shifting like figures trapped behind a veil. The ground pulsed beneath him, slick with something that looked like veins stretching into infinity. And then the whispers began. Not from a single voice, not from the air, from inside him. You are here now. You cannot leave. You are part of the school. Holloway clamped his hands over his ears, but it didn't help. The whispers weren't coming from outside. They were burrowing through his skin, through his veins, through his bones. He staggered forward, vision blurring. There was no direction, only endless, pulsing ground beneath him and that twisting, writhing sky above. His body didn't feel like his anymore. Something had hollowed him out. Something was still inside. And then the ground split open. A mouth, not a hole, a mouth, stretching wide, too wide, rows of blackened teeth lined with tiny reaching fingers. And from its depths, it spoke, not in words, in memories. His memories. Scenes ripped from his own past, twisted and broken. His mother's voice, but not hers. Too sharp, too jagged. The echo of his childhood home, but warped, rotting at the edges. The school's rules, spoken in a voice that had never belonged to anything human. And then his own voice. But it wasn't him speaking. You broke the rules. You let them in. Now you will become one of us, Holloway screamed, and the mouth, it laughed. The world shifted, not like time passing, not like a dream, like something flipping inside out. Holloway fell again, but this time he didn't land. He kept falling. Falling through the school. Not the way it had been before. Not the way it was supposed to be. It was wrong. The halls twisted, curling like serpents made of stone and shadow. Doors snapped open and shut, revealing glimpses of things that should never be seen. A room filled with desks made of bone. A library where the books screamed. A hallway lined with mirrors, but none of them showed him. And through it all, they watched. The hollow ones, standing too still, waiting, silent. Their heads tilted slightly, as if listening. Holloway landed hard, his body jarring against the cold stone. The school had taken him back, but something was different. Something was missing. He felt lighter. Wrong. Like part of him had been left somewhere else. His fingers twitched, but he couldn't feel them properly. His breath came in shallow gasps, but it didn't sound like his breath anymore. He looked down and froze. His shadow, it wasn't his. It moved independently. It twisted and twitched, reaching for something unseen. And then it looked up at him. Not just movement, not just a trick of the light. His shadow had eyes. Holloway staggered back, his chest tightening. The eyes followed. A mouth began to form. And then it whispered, "Not you anymore." The rules. He had to remember the rules. He had already broken too many, but if there was still a way out, it had to be in the rules. His mind raced, fighting against the whispers curling through his skull. Do not follow the sounds of footsteps that do not belong. Too late. He had already done that. Do not speak to the ones that stand too still. Too late. They had already spoken to him first. If you find a door you do not recognize, do not go through it. Too late. That was how this all started. Never step beyond the school grounds. His breath hitched. That was it. He had stepped outside. He had crossed the threshold, and the school had taken him back. But what if he stepped through again? What if he left, knowing what was waiting on the other side? Not as an escape, as a choice. The hollow ones stood silently in the corridor, waiting, watching. If he stayed, he would become one of them. But if he left, if he chose to step through, knowing what lay beyond, would the school let him go? Or would it consume him entirely? The walls twitched. The whispers grew louder. His shadow's mouth stretched wider. There was no time left. Holloway turned and ran. The corridor stretched too long, too far. It wasn't just a hallway anymore. It was a living thing, growing, twisting, pulling him deeper. The walls pulsed. The floor quivered beneath his steps, like flesh wrapped in old stone. The air tightened around him, pressing into his skin like invisible fingers, slowing him down, forcing him to feel every inch of the school sinking its teeth into him. And behind him, the whispering things moved. They didn't chase. They didn't run. They waited, because they knew something he didn't. Holloway wasn't escaping. He was going exactly where they wanted him to go. His chest heaved, lungs burning. His footsteps didn't sound like his own anymore. They came back at him wrong, as if something else was running alongside him, inside him. And then the door appeared. It hadn't been there before, but it was there now. Tall, wrong, not wood, not metal, something in between, something breathing. The rules clawed through his mind. If you find a door you do not recognize, do not go through it. But he had no choice. The walls were closing, the floor was sinking, and the hollow ones had stopped waiting. They moved now, their heads twitching, their mouths stretching wide in silent, grinning anticipation. The door opened before he could touch it. Something reached for him, and Halloway fell through. He landed hard, not on stone, not on the pulsing, living ground of the school, on something colder. Something familiar. His vision swam, the world jerking in and out of focus. The floor beneath him was tile, old, yellowed, speckled with tiny dark stains. He knew this place, the detention room. His breathing hitched. For a second, just a second, everything looked normal. The chairs were empty. The blackboard was smudged with chalk. The old clock on the wall ticked. But it was too quiet. Even the air felt muted, as if the sound had been drained from the world. And then the door creaked. He didn't turn, didn't want to see, didn't want to know what was about to step through. But he had to. Slowly, his eyes flickered to the doorway, and something was standing there. Not one of the hollow ones. Not a shadow. Not something reaching from the twisted places beyond the school's walls. It was him, or something wearing his skin. It stood just outside the threshold, tilting its head in slow, unnatural jerks. Its face was his, but the eyes, they weren't. They were wide, too black, like empty holes carved into flesh. And when it smiled, Halloway felt something inside him tear. It wasn't just a copy. It wasn't just something pretending. It had been waiting for him, and now it was taking its place. The whispers returned, curling through his ears, winding through his ribs. You left. You broke the rule. Something else gets to take your place. Halloway's breath came ragged. The thing stepped forward, its limbs stretched too long, its movements lagged behind, like a video glitching out of sync. Halloway couldn't move. The thing leaned closer and whispered, "Go." It pointed to the window, a window that shouldn't have been there, a window leading outside. The school did not let people leave. Not really. But Halloway had already broken the rules, and the school was making an exception. He staggered toward the window, the air thickening around him, pressing against his skin like invisible hands trying to hold him back. The thing behind him did not follow. It only watched, waiting. He reached the window, and it was open. The air outside felt real, cold, sharp, but Halloway knew if he left, he wasn't coming back. Not really. Not as himself. Not as the person who had first stepped into this school. Something else was already taking that place. His hands trembled on the windowsill. Behind him, the walls began to twist. The desk sank into the floor. The air rippled, tearing open. The school was falling apart, or maybe it was closing in. Halloway climbed up. The window frame stretched wider, like a mouth, like something swallowing him whole. And then he fell through. Cold air slammed into his lungs. He hit the ground, gasping, the grass damp beneath his hands. Grass, not stone, not pulsing flesh, not the school. He blinked hard, the world snapping back into focus. The night sky stretched above him. Stars, clouds. The wind whispered through the trees. Real wind, not the voices that had sunk into his skin. He was outside. He was free. But his stomach turned. Something was wrong. His hands shook as he lifted them, staring at his fingers. But they weren't his fingers. Too long. Too thin. They didn't feel like part of him anymore. His breath hitched. He scrambled to his feet, every movement wrong. The wind felt too sharp. The air felt too thick. And then he turned to the school, to the window, and saw his own face staring back at him from the other side. It stood there, smiling, and waved. The whispers curled through the night. You left. You broke the rule. Something else gets to take your place. Halloway staggered back. The school's walls began to fade, not collapsing, not breaking, just disappearing, like it had never been there at all. Like it had never existed, like it had taken something from him, and now it no longer needed to stay. And deep in his bones, in the marrow of his very being, Halloway knew he hadn't escaped. He had been let go. The night air pressed against his skin, but it felt wrong, like it wasn't touching him the same way anymore, like it didn't recognize him. But the thing wearing his face was still there, on the other side of nothing, grinning, watching. The longer Halloway stared, the more his mind twisted, as if it wasn't just his eyes seeing something they weren't supposed to. It was something deeper, something primal. The thing tilted its head, slow, wrong. A movement he knew too well, because it was his. And then with a slow, deliberate motion, it turned around and walked away. Not fading, not vanishing, just leaving. Into the nothingness where the school had been. Halloway tried to move, but his body didn't respond the way it should. His fingers curled, but they felt too long. His breath came in shallow gasps, but his lungs stretched too deep. And then he saw his hands. Not just fingers that were too thin, too stretched, but the color was wrong. Not pale, not flesh, not human. Something dark, like shadow stretched too far over bone. His stomach twisted, the weight of something being wrong settling deep inside him. He stumbled forward, legs trembling beneath him. The grass whispered under his feet, not rustling, not shifting, whispering. A sound that wasn't a sound, a feeling that wasn't a feeling. And then he heard it. A voice. Not outside of him. Not in his ears. Inside. You left. The whisper slithered through his ribs, curling into his breath. You left, and something else took your place. His hands shook. He clenched his fists, the skin or whatever covered him now, stretching too tight over bones that didn't feel like his. He had to move, had to get away from this place, from the nothing that had swallowed the school. He turned. The street was still there, empty, silent, too dark. The houses stood in the distance, their windows staring like hollow eyes. He took a step toward them, and the sky flickered, not like lightning, not like a trick of the eye, like something was wrong. Like reality itself had glitched. The stars stretched, the clouds twisted, and the ground beneath him shivered. Not shaking, not trembling, something deeper, something inside of it waking up, a breath that was not his own. And then the streetlights went out, not one by one, not flickering, just gone, swallowed by the same nothing that had taken the school. Darkness crashed down around him, and in that darkness, something moved, not footsteps, not rustling, something shifting. Like bodies pressing through fabric, like something trying to step through. The whisper inside him laughed. You're not supposed to be here anymore. You left. You broke the rule. You should have disappeared with the school. Halloway's breath hitched. The darkness curled around him, and from inside it, figures began to emerge. Not human, not shadow, something in between. They didn't have faces, didn't have eyes, didn't need them. They knew him, because he was one of them now. His stomach twisted, his bones ached, the whispering figures circled. They didn't speak, but he knew what they wanted. He had broken something, a rule he didn't even understand. He should have been consumed with the school, erased, but he had left. And now, the world didn't know what to do with him. He wasn't supposed to exist, and neither were they. They were the things that should have vanished, things left behind, and now they wanted him to join them. The whisper inside him screamed, a soundless shuddering noise that made his vision tear at the edges. He staggered backward. The figures stepped closer, reaching, stretching. Their hands were wrong. Not hands, not claws. Something between, something becoming. Halloway ran. The ground bent beneath him. His legs moved too fast, too light, too unnatural. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. He had to get away. Before the world decided to take him back. Or worse, before it decided to make him something else entirely. The houses blurred past him. The sky flickered again. Reality glitched. And then he saw it. His house. The porch light was on. Warm, familiar, real. His chest heaved, his breath ragged. If he could just make it inside, maybe the world would forget about him. Maybe he could just pretend. Pretend he hadn't left. Pretend he still belonged. Pretend he was still Halloway. He hit the steps, legs trembling. His fingers gripped the doorknob, and for a second, just a second, the whispering stopped. The world went still. And then, his mother's voice called from inside. Halloway? Is that you? His breath caught, his throat tightened. He hadn't told her, hadn't called her, hadn't seen her in months. But the voice, it was hers. Soft, gentle, familiar, real. But something inside him screamed, because his mother had never called him Halloway, not once. She always called him by his first name. And this voice, it had said Halloway, like it was testing it out, like it was trying to see if the name fit. His blood ran cold. The whisper curled against his ribs, and behind him, the figures had stopped, watching, waiting, because they knew, they already knew. He wasn't going inside. Because it wasn't his house anymore. It wasn't his life anymore. Because he had already been replaced, and whatever was waiting inside, it wasn't his mother. It wasn't anything. A thing pretending, a thing testing the weight of his name on its tongue. His fingers trembled against the doorknob, the cold metal searing against his skin, grounding him for a split second. Then a shadow shifted in the window. Not a person, not something standing there, just movement, a distortion, like something was breathing inside the walls. The whisper inside him coiled, tightening. Not real, not real, not real. He couldn't go inside. He knew that now. But the moment he let go of the doorknob, something outside changed. The air grew thick, the night hummed, and the street behind him, it was gone. The houses, the road, the streetlights erased, swallowed by the same nothing that had taken the school. And in that nothing, the figures still watched, unmoving, silent, waiting for him to make a choice. Go inside, into a house that was no longer his, or stay outside in a world that had already forgotten him. His stomach knotted. He couldn't do either, couldn't step forward, couldn't turn back. And then, the door creaked open, just an inch, a sliver of darkness spilling from inside. And from that sliver, a voice whispered, closer this time, right by the doorframe. "Come in, Holloway." His heart slammed against his ribs. It wasn't asking, it was telling. His hands clenched into fists, and then a hand slid through the gap in the door, not reaching, not grabbing, just pressing against the wood. The fingers curled slightly, bracing, like something inside was pulling itself forward. Holloway took a sharp step back. His foot hit the wooden porch, but the sound was wrong. Not the dull thud of footsteps, not the groan of old boards, but something else. A wet, sinking noise, like stepping into something soft. His stomach twisted. His gaze snapped downward. The wood beneath him, it wasn't wood anymore, not completely. It moved, shuddered, like skin stretched too thin over something breathing underneath. And it was breathing, slow, rhythmic, like a pulse, like a heartbeat. His. Holloway yanked his foot back, and the house sighed. The sound came from inside the walls, inside the doorframe, inside the living thing the house had become. The fingers still clung to the door. They twitched once, and then they dug in. The wood splintered, or maybe it wasn't wood anymore either. Maybe it was just a shell now, a hollow thing waiting to be filled. "Come in." The whisper grew thicker. Not a voice anymore, a Kneed. Holloway stumbled back, pulse hammering. He turned. The street was still gone. No escape, only the figures in the nothingness, watching, waiting. A choice, one he didn't understand, one he never agreed to, but one he had to make, because something was coming, from inside the house, from inside the nothing, from inside him. The whisper in his ribs laughed. He couldn't stay here, couldn't stand still, because if he did, something else would choose for him. His breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. His mind raced. The figures behind him weren't moving. They didn't have to. They already knew. They'd seen others before him, others who'd stepped too far from where they belonged, others who'd broken the rules. Holloway swallowed hard. His fingers twitched. His whole body felt wrong, like he'd already been touched by whatever this was, like he was already becoming. And then a sound from inside the house, not a whisper, not a voice, not a command, something dragging, slow, heavy, moving toward the door, coming for him. His pulse spiked. He had to go, now. Not forward, not inside, but away. But there was no away, just the nothing, just the watching figures, just the whisper in his ribs, twisting tighter, waiting for him to fail. And then, one of the figures moved. Not stepped, not walked, just shifted, like a frame skipping forward in time. 1 second it was still, the next it was right in front of him. Holloway's lungs locked. His body seized. He couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything. The figure didn't touch him. It just stood there, close enough to feel, close enough to know. And then it leaned in, not bending, not shifting, just folding closer. And when it spoke, it wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't anything at all. "You don't belong here." And for the first time, Holloway knew. He understood. He wasn't supposed to exist anymore, because the school was gone. And he should have been gone with it. Erased, like the others, like the ones who came before. But he hadn't been erased. He had stayed, and now the world was correcting itself. The figure stepped back, the darkness rippled, and something behind him cracked. The air shifted. Holloway didn't turn, didn't look, because he knew the thing inside the house was stepping onto the porch now, reaching, stretching, ready to take him in. And the thing in front of him, it was ready to pull him into nothing. Two choices, neither of them his. And in the silence between them, a third option opened. Not forward, not back, but through the rules, through the in-between, through what wasn't supposed to be. And Holloway jumped, not forward, not back, but through. And for a moment, there was nothing. No ground beneath him, no air in his lungs, no sound, just an endless empty space swallowing him whole, a place that shouldn't exist. But then, he landed, hard. The impact slammed into his body, his bones rattling from the force. The air rushed back into his lungs in a violent gasp, burning like fire. Halloway's fingers scraped against something rough, concrete, and slowly the world snapped back into focus. He was in a hallway, a long, empty corridor stretching into darkness, lined with doors on either side. The air was thick, damp, filled with the scent of old dust and something rotten. It wasn't his house. It wasn't the school. It wasn't anywhere he'd ever seen before. But it felt familiar, like he'd been here before, in some distant nightmare he couldn't remember. The silence pressed against him, heavy and unnatural. No sound, no movement. But he wasn't alone. Something was here, watching, waiting. Halloway's pulse pounded in his ears. He turned and froze. At the end of the hallway, where the shadows curled like living things, a figure stood, tall, unmoving. Not one of the faceless things from before. Something worse. Something that knew him. He couldn't see its face, but he felt its gaze, like ice sinking into his skin. A voice slithered through the silence, not a whisper, not an echo, but a promise. You don't belong. The words latched onto him, sinking into his ribs, wrapping around his spine. The thing at the end of the hallway tilted its head, and then it moved. Not walking, not stepping, just closing the distance. 1 second it was at the end of the hall. The next, it was closer, then closer. Halloway's breath caught, his legs locked, but his body screamed to run. He turned, the hallway had changed. The doors were gone, the walls were wrong, twisting, warping, pulsing like a living thing. And then the lights went out. Total darkness. Something breathed behind him. Close, too close. A voice curled against his ear. You were supposed to be erased. Halloway ran, blindly, desperately. The floor shifted beneath him, stretching, shrinking, bending in impossible ways. The hallway never ended. Or maybe he wasn't running at all. Maybe he was stuck, trapped in this place between places. Something brushed his arm, cold, wet. Not a hand, not a body, something else. Something that wanted to pull him apart, to fix the mistake. His chest heaved, panic clawing up his throat. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He was already disappearing. And then, a door appeared. A single metal door, standing alone in the endless dark. It wasn't there before. It shouldn't be there now, but it was. And it was open. Beyond it, light. Halloway lunged forward. His fingers closed around the edge of the doorway. Something screamed behind him. Not a voice, not a sound. Something worse. The feeling of being ripped away from existence. Hands, so many hands, reaching from the dark, grabbing, pulling, trying to drag him back. He forced himself through the door, and everything shattered. The darkness collapsed. The cold was gone. And suddenly, he was outside, standing in the middle of the street. A real street, with houses, with streetlights, with the night sky above him. Real stars, real air, real silence. His knees buckled. He hit the pavement hard, gasping, his whole body trembling. The weight was gone, the watching figures, the voices, the wrongness, gone. But something wasn't right. He could feel it. A presence. A hole in the air where something should be. He turned slowly. Behind him, the school was back, standing exactly where it had always been, like it had never vanished. But something was different. The windows were dark, the doors were closed, and something was watching him from inside. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it. A final whisper brushed against his mind. You don't belong. The ground beneath him shuddered. The sky shifted, and deep in the distance, a bell rang. A single echoing sound. A warning, or a beginning. And then, everything went black.